Blumenbach was still a student here in Göttingen when on February the 23rd of 1775, he wrote a letter to Albrecht von Haller in Bern, at the time the greatest glory of the University of Göttingen. He stated that for several years he had been collecting all diversities and anomalies concerning humankind, and added that his was an enterprise which has to defend the rights of mankind, die Rechte der Menschheit, and to oppose the ludicrous confusion between a true ape, such as the orangutan, and diseases of the human body as the white mole. He also added that he looked for all drawings and information relative to peculiar nations, as well as for their skulls, and that he believed to have noticed among his acquaintances a true white Moor of our climate. This quotation seems to me significant because it contains, first, a moral appeal to die Rechte der Menschheit, which, in my view, inspired all his work on the natural history of man. Furthermore, information on his early research method and reference to one of his lasting contributions, albinism. What we call albinism was a great puzzle to 17th and 18th century scholars. How could one explain that parents of color could generate white children? But this was what travel accounts reported. Cases had been seen in Java, Borneo, Manila, India, Malabar, the Kingdom of Loango, in practically Congo, Guinea, Panama, Brazil, Mexico. Incredulity reigned. Also when cases were presented at the Royal Society in London or at the Académie des Sciences in Paris. And very different opinions, interpretations, and evaluations were advanced. When Blumenbach wrote to Haller in 1775 and published his dissertation, he based his analysis mainly on written sources and personal experience, and not on what I call non-verbal sources, such as illustrations and paintings, which were not generally available to scholars. I wish to show a selection, as an homage to Blumenbach's memory, because he surely would have liked them. This is a sketch by Albrecht Eckhout, and there is a reference when he was in Brazil, and there is a reference in Margraaf's work on the natural history of Brazil of 1648. So the sketch was presumably done in the early 40s. This is a portrait of Benedetto Silva d'Angola by an Italian painter, of course, Antonio Franchi, 1709. The name of Benedetto Silva is here. And he was the servant to the private chamber of Cosimo III of the Medici family. This is again, 10 years later, a portrait of Benedetto Silva d'Angola by Domenico Tempesti. And probably the most important is this child, a portrait of Mapondé, This is very important, really, because when the famous child was shown in Paris in 1744, and a child of whom Maupertuis spoke and wrote about, Fontenelle and Voltaire, strangely enough, they never produced a painting. This painting is in Stockholm, and we can find out the name of the young man, of the young boy, because of the correspondence between the then, let us call him, Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Gustaf Tessin, who had read Maupertuis' work and who asked the ambassador, the Swedish ambassador in Paris, to send him a painting of this young boy. The story of this I have given, and it is quite interesting for other reasons that I have no time to tell now. According to Linnaeus, the individuals we name albinos did not belong to any of the four varieties of man, Homo sapiens, Homo diurnus, but to the troglodytes, cave dwellers, Homo nocturnus, together with the Homo sylvestris, orangutan. According to Voltaire, they constituted a different race of mankind, were short, very stupid, lived in caves, and were to be found mainly in Central Africa. Finally, according to the Pau, albinos could be seen in many parts of the world, but not in Europe. The following histogram enables to point out quite simply the historical significance of Blumenbach's contribution for a better understanding of albinism. I have considered the literature on albinism for the period 1640-1809. 123 published texts are considered. Of course, my way of carrying out bibliographical analysis is very old-fashioned, and it's not based on a research on Google. One may notice that until 1775, all texts describe albinos only in non-European countries. After Blumenbach's hypothesis that albinos existed also in Europe, things started to change. But as will be shown, this change was not caused by Blumenbach alone. This is a list of Blumenbach's works in which he discussed albinism. There are other works, of course. I will now say something about his 1775 dissertation, and later about his essay, De oculis leucetiopum et iridis motu. Let me say that the expression leucoetiopes is the scholarly expression for albinos in the scholarly literature of the 17th and 18th century. It comes from Plinius and Pomponius Mela, and then was introduced by Isaac Vossius again in the middle of the 17th century. In his 1775 dissertation, Blumenbach wrote, "There is a disorder affecting both the skin and the eyes at the same time. We would call it oculocutaneous albinism. which sometimes occurs amongst men of the most different nations, and among some kinds of quadrupeds. How does one pronounce quadrupeds in English? Quadrupeds, okay, and birds. It's very important, this definition. First, he considered white rabbits and white mice, especially described their eye color and the absence of the black pigment which lines the choroidal membrane and the uvea. Second, he showed that some recent authors provided accounts mixed up with fables, Linnaeus, of the man suffering from this disease, which was also known to the ancients. And he provides the evidence of that. Third, he stated that it attacks man lightly or severely. This distinction lasted for the entire 19th century. Now, specialists divide albinism into approximately 10 categories, but the two main categories he identified. He also stated that in some countries it is rare, in others more frequent, and endemic, being propagated in families. Fourth, he listed the countries where cases of albinism had been noticed and added, I myself have been acquainted for many years with a Saxon youth who suffered from this disease. He also expressed the hypothesis that members of the family of the Milanese 16th century scholar Geronimo Cardano were albinos. Fifth, on the basis of travel accounts, he wrote, examples prove that the mind and the intellectual faculties are in no respect affected by this disorder, against Voltaire. Finally, he concluded, it still remains to be proved that it attacks nations at all times and in all places, and that it partly belongs to the endemic and partly to the sporadic disease. In 1776, Marc Theodore Bourry, a Swiss amateur naturalist and explorer of the Swiss glaciers, described two albinos brothers living in Chamonix, pointing out that, well, they have, ils ont les cheveux, les sourcils, les cils blancs comme du lait, leur teinte à la même blancheur. And then at the end, he says, ces enfants auraient si différents des autres à tous égards, répondent avec justesse aux diverses questions qu'on peut leur faire. A very important, as we shall see, statement, and also the fact that he gives the name albinos is extremely significant. In 1777, Buffon provided an excellent description and illustration of a young albino woman named Geneviève, coming from the Isle of Dominica. I think he was the first to describe clearly what we call nystagmus, the rapid oscillation of both eyes. Against Voltaire, Buffon wrote that albinos did not constitute a specific race, but were degenerated individuals of their own variety, and that the cause of such degeneration had to be looked for in the texture of the skin. He too maintained that albinos existed in Europe. In 1783, Blumenbach went to Chamonix, at the time not an easy trip or journey, to examine the two albino brothers described by Bury, and the next year read a paper on the subject at the Academy. It was published in 86. He carefully described their appearance, eyesight problems, and intellectual capacities. He pointed out that the hair color and their parents, 3 sisters, and the 3rd brother, was chestnut. He reported the results of dissections of the eyes of white rabbits he had carried out, and suggested that the black pigment which lines the choroidal membrane and the posterior surface of the iris had also to be lacking in human albino's eyes. He finally suggested that albinism should be hereditary, and stated that it was present among Europeans. That is in the same year in which he read this, in 1784, the Italian eye surgeon Francesco Buzzi reported the results of the dissection of eyes and skin of a 30-year-old Milanese albino who died in Milan's Ospedale Maggiore. He also described a series of fine dissections of the eyes of white rabbits. There is no time to enter into details. Let me just remember that Buzzi was the first to demonstrate the absence of a pigmentum nigrum in human albino's eyes. He was, however, unable to detach the Malpighian layer of the epidermis from the stratum corneum and the stratum granulosum, which brought him to conclude that albinism arises from a disorder of the Malpighian layer of the epidermis, which is, generally stated, correct. And to surmise that in albinism it might be altogether absent, which is, from our point of view, incorrect. Now the question is, what happened here? As you may see, the number of European albinos that are being described goes up enormously. And this after Blumenbach's publication. There was a small flood of publications which informed that a European albino lived in Würzburg, one in Gotha, another in the Harz Mountains, and another in Denmark, and so on. De Saussure summarized both Blumenbach's and Buzzi's findings in the 2nd volume of his masterpiece. And those pages were translated into English and given prominence in a special publication of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is a description of the 2 albinos of Europe. Something new, completely new. As a consequence, in 1796, Geert Tanner, here in Göttingen, could write, Kakerlaken findet man unter allen 5 Menschenrassen. Liebisch in 1806 repeated the sentence, Kakerlaken findet man unter allen 5 Menschenrassen. William Lawrence in 1819, so far is this variety from being peculiar to the Negro or even to the torrid zone that there is no race of man nor any part of the globe in which it may not occur. Rudolf Wagner, here in Göttingen, man findet unter allen Nationen Albinos. The fact that albinism, a pathology, was present in all the populations of the earth was a further argument, according to Blumenbach, in favor of the unity of the human species. But it was a clue of something just as important: the existence of what we were later called granules of melanin in the Malpighian layer of European skins. As Glover put it in 1840, the occurrence of albinos in all races should induce us to believe the presence of a pigment universal, so that what is said of the coloring matter in the Negro may be extended to all varieties of color, reasoning by analogy. Thank you.